Picture this: you're standing atop the battlements of a castle at dawn, the weight of a crown pressing into your temples. Below you, an entire kingdom stirs to life, its survival hinging on the decisions you'll make before the sun sets. This wasn't just a moment of grandeur, it was the daily reality for medieval rulers, a life where every choice carried the echoes of destiny. The psychological burden of leadership in the Middle Ages wasn't just about politics or power. It was a relentless test of the human spirit, a constant balancing act between duty and survival. These weren't just kings and queens, they were people, flesh and blood, grappling with fears and doubts that would break most of us. And yet, we rarely stop to consider what it truly cost them to wear the crown. Think about the sheer isolation of absolute authority. In a world where trust was as fragile as parchment, medieval leaders couldn't afford weakness. Every advisor might be a spy, every ally a potential betrayer. The pressure to project strength was suffocating, especially when failure meant not just personal ruin, but the collapse of entire dynasties. Wars weren't fought with distant drones but face to face, with the screams of the dying carried on the wind. Succession wasn't a bureaucratic process, it was a high-stakes gamble where the losers often met gruesome ends. And through it all, these rulers had to maintain the illusion of divine favor, as if their very souls were answerable to heaven itself. How did they endure it? What did it do to their minds? That's the question we're unraveling today, because this isn't just history, it's a mirror. The dilemmas of medieval leadership, the loneliness, the impossible choices, the fear of legacy, still haunt modern leaders in boardrooms and parliaments. By stepping into their world, we don't just uncover the past, we unlock timeless lessons about power, pressure, and the price of responsibility. So let's journey beyond the gilded thrones and polished armor, into the minds of those who ruled when every decision was a matter of life or death. Their struggles might be centuries old, but their humanity, that's something we can still feel today. The image of the medieval king, stern, unflinching, radiating divine authority, is one we've seen in countless paintings and films. But peel back the layers of propaganda, and you'll find rulers who are far more human than legend suggests. Take King Henry VI of England, a man who inherited the throne as an infant and spent his life drowning under its weight. When his forces lost key battles in the Wars of the Roses, Henry didn't rally like a storybook hero. He collapsed. For over a year, he was mute, unresponsive, barely able to function, his mind shattered by the unbearable pressure of kingship. This wasn't weakness, it was the inevitable toll of a system that demanded perfection from fragile people. The myth of the unshakable monarch was a survival tactic. In an era where power hinged on perceived divine favor, showing doubt was like handing your enemies a weapon. But behind closed doors, the cracks were everywhere. Chroniclers whispered of Charles VI of France, who believed he was made of glass and screamed if anyone came too close, terrified he'd shatter. Emperor Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire was said to pace his chambers all night, haunted by visions of his own downfall. These weren't eccentricities, they were the symptoms of a crushing reality. Every decision could spark rebellion or famine. Every failure was interpreted as heaven's judgment. What's startling is how little room these rulers had to recover. Modern leaders might step aside for stress leave, but medieval kings had no such luxury. Their vulnerability wasn't just personal, it was a national crisis. A monarch's faltering mind could embolden rivals, fracture alliances, or trigger invasions. That's why so many histories brush these struggles away. Admitting a king's fragility undermined the very foundation of order. But the records that survive tell a different story, of rulers whispering prayers through sleepless nights, of physicians prescribing herbs for melancholy of the crown, of advisors scrambling to hide their lords unraveling from the court. This tension between image and reality shaped entire reigns. Richard II of England, once a confident young king, grew increasingly paranoid, convinced his nobles were plotting against him. He wasn't wrong, they eventually deposed him, but his fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he grasped for control, the more he alienated those who might have supported him. It's a pattern we see again and again, the weight of expectations distorting judgment, turning reasonable caution into paralyzing dread. And unlike modern leaders, medieval rulers couldn't blame stress or burnout. Their culture framed suffering as a spiritual test. If you struggled, it wasn't the job that was impossible, it was you who was unworthy. Yet amid all this, there's something oddly reassuring in these stories. These weren't demigods, they were people brilliant, flawed, and utterly out of their depth at times, just trying to steer a kingdom through storms they couldn't predict. When we strip away the mythology, their struggles feel startlingly familiar. The fear of failure, the loneliness of command, the exhausting performance of confidence, these aren't medieval relics. They're the unspoken burdens of leadership in any age. Perhaps that's why these histories resonate. They remind us that even the mightiest rulers were, in the end, only human. Imagine carrying the crushing belief that your every mistake could bring divine wrath upon your entire kingdom. For medieval rulers, the divine right of kings wasn't just a lofty theory, it was an inescapable psychological trap. Their power wasn't just handed down through bloodlines, it was stamped with the seal of heaven itself, a bad harvest, God's punishment for your sins. A lost battle, a sign you'd fallen from grace. This wasn't mere superstition, it was the framework of their world, shaping how they saw themselves and how their subjects judged them. Take Edward the Confessor, the pious English king who spent hours each night kneeling in prayer, begging for divine guidance. His courtiers praised his devotion, but beneath the surface, this was more than piety, it was desperation. Every decision, from tax policies to troop movements, carried eternal consequences. If he chose wrong, was it mere human error or had God abandoned him? The chronicles don't record Edward's private doubts, but we can hear them in the frantic rituals of rulers like him, the relics clutched before battles, the endless donations to monasteries, the way they scanned the skies for omens before making any major decree. The cruelest twist of the divine right was its unpredictability. A king could be devout, wise, and just yet still face revolts or plagues, and when disaster struck, the whispers began. Look at Richard II, deposed and left to starve in a dungeon. His enemies didn't just frame it as politics, they claimed God had withdrawn his favor from the king. No wonder so many rulers became obsessed with religious displays, like Louis IX of France, who famously washed the feet of the poor. These weren't just acts of charity, they were public proof of divine approval, a shield against doubt. But the weight of this mandate didn't just distort kings, it warped entire kingdoms. When rulers saw rebellions as cosmic tests rather than political grievances, compromise became unthinkable. Why negotiate with traitors if God had ordained your absolute authority? This mindset turned conflicts into holy wars where surrender wasn't just defeat, it was sacrilege. The 100 Years' War, the investiture controversy, the Albigensian Crusade, all were fueled by rulers convinced heaven itself backed their cause. Yet amid this fervor, the most heartbreaking moments come from those who questioned their own worthiness. Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging the Pope's forgiveness, his crown suddenly meaningless without the Church's blessing. Here was the paradox: the very doctrine meant to solidify their power could strip it away in an instant. No modern leader faces stakes quite like that, knowing their soul and their kingdom's fate hung in the balance of celestial judgment. What's haunting is how these rulers internalized the burden. They didn't just fear failure, they feared divine rejection. The sleepless nights spent reciting psalms, the pilgrimages taken in secret, the way they'd pore over ancient prophecies for clues to their destiny. These were the coping mechanisms of souls straining under an impossible standard. Modern psychology might call it imposter syndrome, but for them, it was existential. A king's worth wasn't measured in accomplishments alone, but in the unseeable, unprovable favor of God. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson here. Absolute power didn't free these rulers, it trapped them in a gilded cage of celestial expectations. They ruled not just over lands, but over narrative stories of providence, of punishment, of divine whim. Peel back the velvet and gold, and you'll find the same human frailties we all carry. The need for validation, the terror of inadequacy, the longing to believe our struggles mean something. The thrones may be empty now, but that weight, the crushing need to prove you're worthy, still lingers wherever power resides. War wasn't just a test of strength for medieval rulers, it was a relentless assault on their conscience. Picture Richard the Lionheart surveying the field the night before a battle, the weight of his choices pressing heavier than armor. Every command he'd give at dawn would ripple outward in screams and blood, and he knew it. These weren't distant strategists moving pieces on a map. They were men who fought alongside their soldiers, who saw the faces of the dying and carried their names long after the fighting ended. The chronicles glorify their victories, but what of the nights they spent tallying the cost? Consider the Battle of Agincourt, where Henry V of England secured a legendary triumph, but at what price? His exhausted, outnumbered forces slaughtered thousands, a victory so brutal it left even the king hollow. Years later, he'd still wake from dreams of the mud-choked field, the cries of the French nobility trapped in their heavy armor as English arrows rained down. And for every Agincourt, there were a dozen crushing defeats where rulers had to face the widows and orphans of the men they'd led to disaster. How do you stand before a mother and explain that her son died for a crown's ambition? The grief wasn't just philosophical, it was deeply personal. Medieval kings didn't lead faceless armies. They fought alongside knights they'd known since childhood, men who'd sworn oaths to them in candlelit halls. When the Black Prince lost his closest companions at Poitiers, his sorrow seeped into letters and chronicles, raw and unguarded. These rulers weren't just losing soldiers, they were burying friends, confidants, sometimes even family. The Wars of the Roses turned brother against brother, cousin against cousin, until the battlefield became a nightmare of familiar faces. And then there were the impossible choices, the moments where mercy and pragmatism clashed. A king might spare a rebellious lord to keep the peace, only for that same lord to rise against him later, costing more lives, or worse, ordering the execution of prisoners, as Henry V did at Agincourt, knowing it was militarily necessary but morally devastating. These decisions didn't just haunt their sleep, they shaped their legacies. Chroniclers would debate their ruthlessness or weakness for centuries, but in the moment, there were no clean answers, only variations of guilt. The physical toll was just as merciless. These weren't desk-bound leaders. They marched with their men, slept in the same mud, faced the same diseases. Richard the Lionheart nearly died from dysentery during the Crusades, his body failing as his army starved outside the walls of Acre. The stress of command aged rulers prematurely, lines etched by sleepless nights plotting supply routes, bargaining with mercenaries, or staring at maps wondering where the enemy would strike next. Their bodies bore the scars of battle, but their minds carried wounds no physician could heal. What's most striking is how rarely they could show any of this vulnerability. A king weeping for his fallen soldiers might be seen as pious or weak. Every display of emotion was a political act, scrutinized by allies and enemies alike. So they buried their grief in rituals, founding monasteries to honor the dead, commissioning illuminated manuscripts to recast butchery as divine will, wearing hair shirts beneath their robes as private penance. The gap between their public resolve and private torment was vast, and it's in those cracks we see them not as legends, but as human beings. Perhaps that's why so many turn to religion, not just for legitimacy, but for absolution. The same kings who ordered massacres would leave their crowns to go on pilgrimage, walking barefoot for miles to atone. They knew the weight of what they'd done. In the quiet of chapels, far from the demands of statecraft, they could finally kneel not as sovereigns, but as sinners, men who'd sent others to die and had to live with it. That duality is the heart of their burden. The crown demanded blood, but the soul craved redemption, and between those two hung the fragile humanity of those who ruled. Trust was a currency more dangerous than gold in the courts of medieval Europe. For rulers perched on unstable thrones, every smile could hide a dagger, every oath a carefully laid trap. King John of England didn't earn his nickname, Lackland, just for losing territories. He became infamous for seeing enemies where none existed, turning allies into fugitives on little more than a whim. His reign was a masterclass in self-sabotage, where suspicion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you punish loyalty as harshly as betrayal, why should anyone remain loyal? The machinery of paranoia was brutally efficient. Spies lurked in shadowed corridors, their whispers fueling midnight arrests. Noble families learned to guard their words, knowing a careless joke at supper could lead to the tower by dawn. Even marriage alliances, those carefully woven bonds meant to secure peace, often unraveled into nests of conspiracy. Just look at the fate of Richard II's closest advisors, men like Simon Burley, who'd served him since childhood, executed by political rivals while the king watched helplessly. If lifelong devotion couldn't guarantee safety, what could? This atmosphere didn't just distort judgment, it reshaped entire governments. Henry VIII's later reign became a revolving door of fallen favorites, where ministers like Thomas Cromwell rose to dizzying heights only to meet the axe. The Tower of London's walls held more discarded advisors than rats, and with each purge the paranoia deepened. A ruler who eliminated one threat didn't feel safer. They became hyper-aware of the next potential traitor, real or imagined. It was a vicious cycle. The more you cracked down, the more isolated you became, and isolation bred even wilder suspicions. Some rulers weaponized this fear deliberately. Vlad the Impaler famously dined among corpses to unsettle visitors, turning terror into a political tool. But most weren't calculating tyrants. They were desperate leaders clinging to power in systems where assassination was routine. The anarchy in England, the Wars of the Roses, the endless coups of the Byzantine Empire, these weren't exceptions. They were the norm. Small wonder so many monarchs developed obsessive rituals, like Charles VI of France insisting his food be tasted by multiple servants before each meal. When poison could lurk in a goblet, trust was literally a matter of life and death. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Chroniclers wrote of rulers who jumped at slamming doors, who banned certain colors because assassins once wore them, who saw omens in thunderstorms or the flight of birds. Sleep became a rare luxury. King Louis XI of France kept a revolving staff of barbers on call, fearing a rested blade might slip too deep. Even victories tasted bitter. After crushing the pilgrimage of Grace Rebellion, Henry VIII reportedly wandered his palaces at night, tormented by visions of the executed rebels. Power hadn't brought security, only the certainty that danger was always one step behind. And yet, the cruelest irony was how often this paranoia created the very threats it feared. When Edward II alienated his nobles with erratic purges, they didn't just rebel, they forced him to abdicate, then allegedly murdered him with a red-hot poker. The lesson was clear: rule by fear, and you'll eventually face the terrified. But what alternative did they have in a world where royal children weren't spared, where the princes in the tower vanished without a trace? Forgiving the wrong person could mean the end of your line. Perhaps that's why so many sought refuge in symbolic displays of control. The tower's torture chambers, the public executions, the elaborate spy networks, these weren't just tools of oppression. They were attempts to impose order on a system where chaos always lurked beneath the surface. Modern leaders fret over approval ratings. Medieval rulers woke each morning wondering if today was the day their closest friend would become their executioner. That constant, gnawing uncertainty didn't just shape policies, it shaped souls. Strip away the crowns and the heraldry, and you're left with something profoundly human. The terrible loneliness of knowing you can't trust anyone, but you can't rule alone. Elena of Aquitaine's chambers weren't just rooms, they were gilded cages. As queen of both France and later England, she wielded unprecedented influence, yet the very power that elevated her also severed her from genuine human connection. Courtiers bowed, poets flattered, but who dared speak frankly to the woman who held their fates in her hands? This was the paradox of medieval royalty, surrounded by crowds yet utterly alone. The higher you rose, the fewer shoulders remained to lean on. The diaries of rulers like Isabella of Castile reveal this isolation in raw, private moments. Between entries about state affairs, she scribbled prayers for strength, confessions of exhaustion, even fleeting wishes for simpler lives. These weren't just personal musings, they were survival tactics, a rare outlet for vulnerabilities never shown in public. For male rulers, the burden was equally crushing. Charlemagne, despite his legendary charisma, reportedly wept alone after banquets, overwhelmed by the knowledge that even his closest companions measured every word in his presence. Marriage, often framed as partnership, frequently deepened the solitude. Political unions came with spies embedded in household staff, turning intimacy into a performance. When Anne Boleyn whispered to Henry VIII, she knew ladies-in-waiting were eavesdropping for rival factions. Some monarchs sought escape in forbidden relationships, like Richard the Lionheart's rumored bond with Philip Augustus of France, connections that, if exposed, could trigger scandals. These clandestine ties weren't just affairs, they were lifelines, moments of unguarded honesty in lives otherwise spent performing invincibility. The toll of this loneliness could unravel even the strongest minds. Philip II of Spain retreated into the Escorial's gloomy corridors, obsessively micromanaging his empire's minutiae, unable to delegate without suspicion. His letters show a man drowning in detail, convinced only he could bear the weight of decision-making. Meanwhile, queens like Margaret of Anjou faced harsher constraints, expected to nurture alliances while never appearing too influential, lest they be branded manipulative. The tighter they clung to power, the more they alienated potential allies. Religious confessors became unlikely confidants, offering rulers their only safe space for doubt. Louis IX of France knelt weakly before his chaplain, not just for absolution but for the relief of speaking freely. Yet even this solace was fraught. What if a priest shared secrets with the Pope or rival nobles? The infamous downfall of Thomas Becket, once Henry II's closest friend, proved how quickly spiritual counsel could twist into political betrayal. Artifacts from the period whisper of quieter rebellions against this isolation. The intricate locks on Marie Antoinette's private correspondence, The hidden gardens where Elizabeth I strolled without her court. These weren't indulgences but necessities. For a few stolen moments, they could set aside the crown's crushing performance. The tragic irony, their subjects often mistook this need for privacy as arrogance, further widening the gulf between ruler and ruled. Perhaps the most poignant evidence lies in what wasn't recorded. No chronicler wrote of the knights rulers spent staring at palace ceilings, or the meals eaten in silence rather than risk careless words. Their loneliness was the open secret of monarchy, an unspoken tax on power that left no visible scars but shaped history nonetheless. When we study their wars and laws, we're seeing only half the story. The rest lies in the margins, a shaky signature on a midnight decree, a hastily blotted tear on an official document, the spaces between the lines where real people once stood, aching for connection in a world that demanded they reign alone. For medieval rulers, the greatest terror wasn't death, it was the silence of an empty nursery. Henry VIII's infamous marital carousel wasn't just personal drama, it was the unraveling of a man consumed by dynastic dread. Each of his wives' failed pregnancies wasn't merely a private grief, it was a national emergency, a ticking clock that turned bedchamber whispers into matters of state. The Tudor king's desperation for a son didn't just break marriages, it shattered England's religious foundations and left heads rolling in the tower's shadow. But Henry wasn't unique. He was every monarch who ever lay awake wondering if their life's work would crumble because a single child drew breath or didn't. Infant mortality haunted royal households like a spectre. Queen Anne of Bohemia, beloved wife of Richard II, endured 12 pregnancies without a living heir, each loss chipping away at her health and the kingdom's stability. In an age where half of all children died before adulthood, succession planning wasn't strategy, it was gambling with loaded dice. The French royal nursery's grim nickname, the graveyard of princes, wasn't hyperbole. When the last Capetian king perished without a son, it triggered the 100 Years' War, proof that one empty cradle could drown continents in blood. Rival claimants lurked in every shadowed corridor, their very existence a threat. The Wars of the Roses didn't start with battles, they began with whispered debates over genealogies, with distant cousins scrutinizing family trees for drops of royal blood. King Henry IV seized England's throne from Richard II, then spent his reign quelling rebellions from those who remembered his claim was shaky at best. This was the cruel paradox of medieval succession. The more you clung to power, the more you incentivized others to tear you down. Some rulers resorted to unthinkable measures. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II blinded 15,000 Bulgar soldiers not just to punish enemies, but to eliminate future threats, a chilling calculus where cruelty became preventative medicine. Others manipulated marriage markets like chessboards, betrothing children still in swaddling clothes to secure alliances. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain wed their offspring to half the courts of Europe, turning their nursery into a geopolitical command center. The psychological toll seeped into every aspect of rule. Edward III's golden reign was ultimately shadowed by his grandson, Richard II's disastrous rule, proof that even the greatest kings couldn't control the future. The frantic efforts to secure dynasties often backfired spectacularly. Henry VIII finally got his precious son Edward VI, only for the boy to die at 15, plunging England into chaos anyway. Perhaps most tragic were the children thrust into this maelstrom. Mary, Queen of Scots, was crowned at 9 months old, her infancy a political battleground. The boy King Edward V vanished in the Tower at 12, his fate a cautionary tale about the peril of being born too close to power. These weren't just royal offspring, they were living, breathing contingency plans, their nursery rhymes drowned out by the clatter of armor outside their doors. What's often forgotten is how this desperation shaped entire civilizations. Primogeniture, the system favoring firstborn sons, wasn't just tradition. It was a desperate grasp for stability in a world where multiple heirs meant civil war. Salic laws barring female inheritance weren't mere sexism. They were flawed solutions to the nightmare of contested successions. Every coronation oath, every dynastic marriage, every brutal suppression of rival branches grew from the same root terror that a single unguarded moment could undo centuries of careful rule. The true cost of this anxiety lingers in the archives, in Henry VIII's frantic marginal notes on medical texts about conception, in Elizabeth I's refusal to name any successor at all, in the haunted portraits of childless rulers holding empty cradles like scepters. We see it in the way aging kings clung to life, fearing their death would be their kingdom's death knell. Modern leaders worry about legacies. Medieval rulers faced the existential dread that their bloodline, and with it their entire world, might simply blink out between one generation and the next. That weight, heavier than any crown, is what truly defined their reigns. Charlemagne's throne room glittered with gold, his robes heavy with the weight of empire. But when the courtiers dispersed, the same hands that wielded scepter and sword clutched at letters announcing another child's death. This was the unbearable duality of medieval leadership, the flawless marble bust presented to the world and the shattered figure weeping in the shadows. Kings weren't just rulers, they were actors in an unending performance, their crowns serving as both spotlight and shackle. Every public moment was a carefully staged tableau, while private despair festered where no chronicler could see. The masks they wore were masterpieces of political survival. Richard the Lionheart's booming laughter in campfireside tales masked the grief of a crusader who'd abandoned his father's deathbed for war. Elena of Aquitaine's regal composure during Henry II's humiliating imprisonments hid the fury of a woman outmaneuvered by her own sons. These weren't just personal struggles, they were state secrets. A single crack in the facade could embolden rebels or unravel alliances, so they perfected the art of compartmentalization, separating the human from the ceremonial until the division became its own kind of torture. Consider the chilling contrast in Louis IX's reign. The same king who knelt barefoot to wash beggars' feet would retreat to his chambers to self-flagellate, whipping his back raw for imagined failures. His subjects saw a living saint, his confessor saw a man convinced he'd never be worthy. Or look at Ferdinand of Aragon, who dictated triumphant proclamations about the Reconquista while privately mourning the son whose death left his grandest conquests without an heir. Their public selves were tapestries of power, woven with threads of divine right and military glory, but the reverse side showed all the tangled knots and broken strands. The physical toll of this performance was etched into their bodies. Henry VIII's transformation from golden prince to bloated tyrant wasn't just about age or injury. It mirrored the erosion of a man who'd spent decades playing the invincible warlord while privately obsessing over phantom betrayals. The famous Holbein portraits, those masterpieces of propaganda, show rulers frozen in idealized majesty, but private accounts tell another story. Charles V's gout-ridden hands shaking as he signed abdication papers, or Mary Queen of Scots migraines after hours of maintaining regal poise before hostile lords. Some masks became so thick they fused to the wearer. Elizabeth I's Virgin Queen persona. An ingenious political strategy slowly suffocated her private desires until she confessed to aides, "I am more stone than flesh." The longer the performance went on, the harder it became to distinguish the monarch from the human. When Philip II of Spain buried his fourth wife and teenage son in the same year, his letters reveal a father drowning in sorrow, but his official decrees continued uninterrupted, the ink unsmudged by tears. The cruelest twist, their subjects often mistook the performance for reality. Peasants who cheered Richard the Lionheart's triumphant returns never saw him vomiting from stress before battles. Nobles who envied Henry V's battlefield glory didn't witness his nightmares about the prisoners he'd ordered slaughtered. This disconnect bred resentment. Why should kings complain when they lived in palaces, while rulers starved for the simple luxury of being seen as anything but their crown? Perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the objects they clutched in private. Edward I's locket containing his dead wife's hair, Frederick II's encrypted journals filled with existential doubts, Isabella of Castile's worn prayer book with desperate marginal notes. These weren't just mementos, they were pressure valves for souls buckling under the weight of perpetual performance. The tragedy wasn't that they had to wear masks, but that removing them, even for a moment, could topple kingdoms. So they pressed on, their faces carved into expressions of divine certainty, while inside, the human heart kept beating bruised, lonely, and utterly unseen. History's judgment was the specter that haunted medieval rulers long after their battles were fought and their crowns passed on. Richard III didn't just lose his life at Bosworth Field. He lost control of his story, his name twisted into a Shakespearean villain by the very dynasty that overthrew him. But this wasn't just one king's tragedy, it was every monarch's deepest fear. In an age without photographs or recordings, legacy wasn't just about memory, it was about survival. A single unfavorable chronicle could condemn a ruler's soul to eternal infamy, their deeds warped by the pens of those who'd triumphed over them. The scramble to shape narratives began the moment a king took the throne. Commissioning lavish illuminated manuscripts wasn't mere vanity, it was psychological armor. Look at the Bayeux Tapestry, where Harold Godwinson's death is depicted with chilling ambiguity. Was he struck in the eye by an arrow or cut down by Norman swords? The answer depended on who held the needle. Rulers like Alfonso X of Castile didn't just patronize historians. They imprisoned those who wrote unfavorable accounts, proving how desperately they clung to control of their own stories. Even victories could be hollow if poets didn't sing of them correctly. War itself became a theater for legacy building. Henry V didn't invade France solely for territory. He craved the immortal glow of conquest, the kind that would echo in ballads for centuries. The Agincourt campaign was as much about securing his place in history as it was about securing borders. But this obsession bred reckless choices. Charles the Bold of Burgundy pursued military glory with such single-minded fervor that he bankrupted his duchy, his hunger for a legendary reputation blinding him to the crumbling reality around him. The irony, he's remembered but as a cautionary tale, not the hero he envisioned. The cruelest twist was how little control they actually had. No amount of royal patronage could guarantee a flattering epithet. Richard the Lionheart, despite his crusader's aura, was called the absent king by subjects who suffered under his endless wars. Meanwhile, pious rulers like Louis IX of France found their humility weaponized. Critics whispered his saintliness made him weak, unfit for the brutal realities of power. Even the best-intentioned monarchs couldn't dictate how future generations would weigh their compromises and contradictions. Some rulers turned to symbolic gestures, desperate to cement their virtue in the historical record. Edward the Confessor rebuilt Westminster Abbey not just for God, but for the scribes who'd record his piety. Others, like Henry II, staged elaborate public penances after Becket's murder, scrubbing bloodstains from their reputations with theatrical displays of remorse. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were calculated bids for historical absolution, performances designed to sway the chronicler's quills. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was crushing. Letters from aging rulers betray frantic revisions to their wills, last-minute donations to monasteries, even whispered deathbed instructions to burn incriminating documents. Frederick II Hohenstaufen, that brilliant but controversial emperor, spent his final years composing defenses of his reign, as if arguing his case before some celestial court of historians. They weren't just preparing for death, they were preparing for judgment. What's most revealing is how this dread shaped real-time governance. The threat of damnation in the history books made some rulers hesitant, second-guessing every decision. Others, like the Byzantine Empress Irene, took drastic measures blinding her own son to secure power, a crime so shocking it guaranteed her infamy despite her political achievements. The weight of legacy didn't just influence policy, it warped morality, turning preservation of reputation into an all-consuming imperative. Perhaps that's why so many medieval tombs feature idealized effigies nightly, serene, forever frozen in dignified repose. They knew the flesh would decay, but the carved stone face would endure. In the end, their greatest fear wasn't oblivion, but distortion. That centuries later, strangers would peer at their likenesses and see only monsters or fools. That terror, the knowledge that your truest self might be erased by time's eraser, was the final, invisible crown every ruler wore. Philip II of Spain's hands weren't just stiff from signing decrees, they were twisted into claws by gout, a torment so severe he was carried to meetings in a litter, his joints screaming with every movement. But this wasn't just the price of age, it was the body's rebellion against a mind that never rested. Medieval rulers didn't merely endure stress, they metabolized it, their flesh paying the price for decisions that kept kingdoms alive. The same chronicles that record their victories often whisper of darker truths, migraines that blurred vision before battles, rashes that bloomed during crises, teeth ground to stubs by sleepless nights. Medical manuscripts from the period read like coded distress signals. Physicians coined terms like melancholia regalis, the royal melancholy, to describe rulers who collapsed under invisible weights. King Charles VI of France didn't just hallucinate glass bones. His hair fell out in clumps during political upheavals, his skin erupting in sores that mirrored the fractures in his realm. When Henry IV of England developed a festering skin condition during the Welsh rebellions, his doctors didn't blame humours alone. They noted how the lesions worsened with each new revolt. These weren't coincidences, they were the body's brutal accounting of power's cost. The sheer physicality of medieval governance amplified the damage. Unlike modern leaders who delegate details, kings like Philip II personally reviewed troop movements, tax rolls, and spy reports until candles burned to stubs. The Spanish king's infamous paper empire wasn't just a bureaucratic quirk, it was an obsession that left him hunched over desks for 18 hours a day, his spine curving like a question mark. Autopsies later revealed his liver resembled stone, a grotesque monument to decades of stress-induced inflammation. Sleep deprivation became a silent executioner. Richard the Lionheart's battle insomnia was legendary, nights pacing tent flaps while Saracen drums throbbed in the darkness. But it was the quieter, relentless sleeplessness of peacetime that truly eroded health. Queen Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting wrote of her pacing chambers until dawn during the Armada crisis, her famous complexion sallowed by exhaustion. Chronic fatigue didn't just dull reflexes, it warped judgment, turning measured rulers into paranoid shells. The Duke of Burgundy's disastrous decision to charge at Nancy, a mistake that cost him his life, came after weeks of disrupted sleep, his mind fogged by fatigue. Even feasts, those displays of royal abundance, became minefields of stress. Henry VIII's legendary gluttony wasn't mere indulgence, it was stress eating on a dynastic scale, his waistline expanding alongside his anxieties over succession. The richer the dishes, the more his ulcers flared, a cruel irony for a man who used banquets to project control. Digestive ailments plagued rulers from Charlemagne to Frederick Barbarossa, their guts churning with the same tensions that unsettled their realms. The most tragic cases were those misdiagnosed as divine punishment. When the pious Louis IX developed agonizing mouth abscesses during his disastrous crusade, clergy framed it as chastisement for imperfect faith. No one considered that grinding his teeth during months of siege warfare might have shattered his molars. Medieval medicine, blind to psychosomatic connections, often prescribed bloodletting for symptoms rooted in sleepless nights and suppressed terror, treatments that only deepened the spiral. What's haunting is how these rulers interpreted their suffering. They saw plagues and famines as tests from God, but their own failing health, that was personal weakness. The gap between their invincible public image and their private agony became a kind of purgatory, one where crowns offered no protection from the most human of frailties. The real lesson isn't just that stress aged them prematurely, it's that their world had no language for the toll except shame. Their bodies betrayed them long before their kingdoms did, leaving behind not just political legacies, but silent testimonies written in scar tissue and bone. Trusting the wrong advisor could topple a kingdom faster than any army. For medieval rulers, counselors weren't just helpers. They were lifelines in a world where misreading a situation might mean losing your throne or your head. But here's the paradox: the very act of relying on others was a vulnerability. A king who leaned too heavily risked seeming weak. One who ignored advice risked disaster. The court of Henry II of England became a cautionary tale when his friendship with Thomas Becket curdled into murder. That infamous clash wasn't just about power, it was about the unbearable tension between needing guidance and resenting those who dared give it. The best advisors understood their role was as much psychological as political. William Marshall, the knight who served 5 English kings, mastered the art of speaking hard truths without humiliating his lords. He'd wait for private moments, framing advice as strategy rather than correction. But not all rulers tolerated such nuance. Richard the Lionheart famously dismissed cautious counselors before the Third Crusade, surrounding himself instead with yes-men who cheered his reckless marches through enemy territory. The result, a campaign that bled his treasury dry and nearly cost him his life. Medieval courts were echo chambers where flattery could drown out wisdom, and rulers often paid dearly for the silence they'd enforced. Yet the alternative, total isolation, was just as dangerous. When Charles VI of France descended into madness, his nobles fractured into warring factions, each claiming to speak for the crown. Without trusted stewards, the kingdom spiraled into civil war. Contrast this with Ferdinand and Isabella's Spain, where Cardinal Cisneros balanced royal authority with blunt counsel, helping transform a fractured realm into a global power. The difference wasn't just the quality of advice, it was whether rulers could stomach hearing it. Some of history's bloodiest conflicts began with poisoned whispers. The disastrous Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 saw Crusader knights charge into an Ottoman slaughter because advisors exaggerated their chances. Later, Sigismund of Hungary would call it the Council of the Mad. Similarly, the Plantagenet dynasty crumbled partly because Richard II ignored his uncle John of Gaunt's warnings, preferring sycophants who fed his paranoia. The pattern repeats like a grim refrain. Rulers who conflated loyalty with obedience often learned too late that the truest service sometimes meant saying no. The cruelest twist, even good faith efforts could backfire. Thomas More's principled stand against Henry VIII's divorce earned him martyrdom, but left England without its wisest voice during the Reformation's chaos. For every advisor who saved a king from folly, another became a scapegoat for failures. Wolsey's fall from grace wasn't just about failing to secure the papal annulment. It was Henry needing someone to blame for his own impossible demands. This shifting of blame wasn't petty, it was survival. A monarch couldn't afford to appear fallible, so advisors became sacrificial lambs, their disgrace a public demonstration that the crown was never wrong. Perhaps the most revealing dynamic was between female rulers and their counselors. Queens like Elena of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile faced double scrutiny, deemed weak if they relied on men, but unnatural if they didn't. Their solutions were ingenious. Elena governed through networks of abbesses and trusted knights, while Isabella made her confessor her closest advisor, cloaking political savvy in pious collaboration. They navigated the tightrope by making dependence look like divine inspiration. In the end, the advisor relationship mirrored medieval leadership itself, a fragile dance between control and surrender. The wise ruler knew counsel wasn't a crutch but a compass, useless unless you acknowledged you might be lost. But that humility came at a price. Every whispered suggestion carried the ghost of future betrayal. Every honest word a potential death sentence. The advisors who survived weren't necessarily the smartest. They were the ones who remembered their true role wasn't to guide the hand that held the crown, but to keep it from crushing itself. Constantine the Great didn't just see a cross in the sky before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He saw a divine command that would rewrite history. For medieval rulers, signs and portents weren't mere curiosities. They were celestial memos from God himself, scrawled across the heavens in comets and eclipses. A king might spend years crafting battle strategies, only to abandon them because a hare ran left instead of right at dawn. These weren't irrational whims. They were desperate attempts to decode a universe that seemed to speak in riddles, where every natural phenomenon carried the weight of prophecy. Take the case of Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. When Halley's comet blazed across the sky in 1066, his court astrologers didn't marvel at its beauty, they panicked. The fiery streak was interpreted as an omen of regime change, a psychological blow that may have weakened Harold's resolve before facing William the Conqueror at Hastings. Centuries later, Richard III would reportedly delay his coronation because a solar eclipse darkened the skies, fearing it signaled divine displeasure. These rulers weren't ignorant, they were trapped in a world view where nature and divinity were inseparable, where a single unusual cloud formation could unravel years of careful planning. The psychological toll was crushing. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who ruled half of Europe, kept a team of astrologers on retainer, their star charts as vital as his generals' maps. Before signing any major decree, he'd demand celestial readings, his quill hovering over parchment until the planets aligned favorably. The strain was visible in his private letters, where he fretted over whether a recent earthquake in Naples was punishment for taxing the clergy too heavily. For rulers already burdened by political crises, superstition became a relentless background hum, one more variable in an already impossible calculus of power. Some monarchs weaponized this fear. William the Conqueror's propagandists spun the Hastings victory as divine will, pointing to the comet as proof of Norman legitimacy. But more often, omens became paralyzing distractions. When an eclipse coincided with the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, both French and English courts scrambled to interpret it, wasting precious weeks debating heavenly signs while enemy troops advanced. The infamous Mad King, Charles VI of France, wasn't born unstable. His breakdown began after a freak thunderstorm during a military campaign, which he took as a personal curse from God. From that moment, his reign spiraled into paranoia, his decisions dictated by visions rather than statecraft. The cruelest irony, many of these signs had simple scientific explanations. The blood moon that terrified Henry I before his son's drowning was a lunar eclipse. The plague of locusts that made Frederick II postpone his coronation was a seasonal migration. But in an age without meteorology or astronomy as we know it, rulers had no framework to separate coincidence from condemnation. Their education taught them to see divine fingerprints in every anomaly, making their world feel like a haunted house where every creaking floorboard might be the footstep of fate. What's most revealing is how this dread seeped into everyday governance. Coronation dates were set by astrologers, battle plans adjusted for unlucky Fridays, treaties delayed because a courtier dreamed of falcons attacking doves. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I reportedly executed a general not for treason, but because the man's birth chart predicted he'd overthrow the throne. This wasn't just personal belief, it was policy with real consequences for millions who'd never seen an omen in their lives. Yet amid the chaos, there were flashes of pragmatism. Helena of Aquitaine famously mocked superstitions, once quipping that omens are for those who fear to make decisions. But even she kept a silver-handled mirror to deflect the evil eye, proving how deeply these fears ran. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. Medieval rulers didn't turn to omens because they were weak, but because the burden of unchecked power was too immense to bear alone. When every choice could doom or save thousands, it was easier, maybe even comforting, to believe the heavens shared the responsibility. In the end, their superstitions weren't just about controlling fate, they were about surviving the unbearable weight of playing God on earth. Louis IX of France didn't just hold court beneath the oaks of Vincennes, he carried the souls of the condemned in his prayers long after the verdicts were spoken. For medieval kings, justice wasn't merely a duty, it was a spiritual tightrope stretched between earthly authority and heavenly judgment. Every sentence they passed rippled beyond the dungeon walls, echoing in the chambers of divine reckoning. When Louis sentenced a man to hang, he'd fast for 3 days afterward, his body withering in tandem with the fading breath of the executed. This wasn't theater. It was the visceral terror of a ruler who believed his throne sat at the crossroads of mortality and eternity. The mechanics of royal justice amplified this burden. Unlike modern legal systems with layers of appeal, medieval verdicts often rested solely on the king's word. A single gesture, a flick of the wrist, a weary sigh could send families into mourning or spare dynasties from ruin. Take the case of Enguerrand de Coucy, a nobleman who hanged 3 young poachers on his lands. When the boys' grieving families appealed to Louis, the king faced an impossible choice: punish a powerful vassal and risk rebellion, or overlook the crime and betray the peasants who saw him as God's justice on earth. His compromise, forcing Coucy to endow a monastery, satisfied no one, least of all his own conscience. The specter of divine retribution loomed largest in treason cases. When Henry II of England ordered the execution of Thomas Becket's murderers, he didn't just fear political backlash, he dreaded damnation. Chroniclers wrote of him writhing in agony as priests scourged him for the archbishop's blood, his royal robes torn to sackcloth. Even verdicts meant to project strength could backfire spiritually. After crushing the pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, Henry VIII reportedly woke screaming from dreams of the executed rebels dragging him into hellfire. These rulers didn't just govern, they stood as trembling intermediaries between human law and celestial judgment. Some monarchs sought refuge in ritual to ease the moral weight. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, no stranger to brutality, insisted on holding trials during Lent, as if the season of penance could purify his verdicts. Others, like Alfonso X of Castile, codified laws obsessively, desperate to shift blame from their shoulders to the parchment, but the loopholes were always visible. When a starving peasant stole bread, should the king follow the law's harsh penalties or Christ's mercy? Every pardon risked encouraging lawlessness. Every harsh sentence risked divine wrath. The cruelest trials were those involving family. Few moments expose this torment like Philip Augustus of France, sentencing his own son to life imprisonment for rebellion. The chronicler Rigord describes the king weeping as he signed the order, his quills shaking like a leaf in a storm. Here was the unbearable paradox. The same divine right that justified his rule demanded he sacrifice paternal love on the altar of justice. Small wonder so many rulers like John of England preferred to let others play executioner, their signatures smudged by sweat as they delegated the bloody work. What's often overlooked is how this dread shaped entire legal systems. The invention of trial by jury under Henry II wasn't just about fairness. It was a monarch's attempt to share the spiritual burden of judgment. The elaborate coronation oaths swearing to protect the innocent weren't political formalities. They were public admissions that kings knew their souls hung in the balance. Even the famed mercy of rulers like Saint Edward the Confessor reveals the tension. His chroniclers boast of his leniency, but royal accounting rolls show surging prison populations when he feared divine displeasure. The true cost of this weight lingers in the margins of history. In the Alnwick Castle archives, a scribe once doodled a sketch of Henry II's nightmare naked souls pointing at their wounds, each labeled with the name of a man he'd condemned. Whether the king ever saw it is unknown, but the message is clear. Medieval rulers didn't just fear the gallows or the assassin's knife. They feared the moment when they'd stand stripped of crowns and finery, answering for every life they'd broken in the name of justice. That terror, the knowledge that no amount of gold or guards could shield them from ultimate judgment, was the heaviest sentence of all. Diplomatic chambers in the medieval world were battlefields without swords, where a single misplaced word could unravel decades of truces. Picture Henry V of England seated across from Charles VI of France, the air thick with tension as scribes hovered over parchment, each comma a potential landmine. These weren't just meetings, they were psychological marathons where rulers had to read every flicker of an eyelid, every hesitation before a signature, while masking their own exhaustion. The Treaty of Troyes, which declared Henry heir to France, wasn't won on the battlefield alone. It was secured in candlelit rooms where the king fought fatigue as fiercely as his enemies, his mind sharpened by the knowledge that one drowsy concession could doom his life's work. The strain of these negotiations left scars invisible to chroniclers. Isabella of Castile's letters reveal how her hands trembled after hours of debating Portugal's envoys, her voice hoarse from arguing territorial lines while hiding her desperation to secure her daughter's safety. For every public display of regal composure, there were private collapses like Frederick Barbarossa's infamous meltdown during the Peace of Venice talks, where he reportedly hurled an ink pot after days of Byzantine wordplay. These outbursts weren't mere tempers, they were the ruptured seams of minds stretched too thin by the relentless chess game of diplomacy. The cruelest trick was the asymmetry of these encounters. While kings and queens bore the full weight of decisions, their adversaries often had teams of fresh advisors rotating in shifts. When Richard the Lionheart negotiated Saladin's surrender at Acre, the Sultan's envoys arrived rested and prepared, while Richard had spent the prior night drafting terms alone, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The physical toll compounded the mental gymnastics rulers expected to debate for 12 hours straight without meals, their stomachs growling as they passed loopholes in Latin clauses. Some rulers turned to theatricality as a weapon. Louis XI of France, nicknamed the Spider King, perfected the art of staged vulnerability, slumping in his chair mid-negotiation, murmuring about his frail health, only to pounce when opponents lowered their guard. Others weaponized silence, like Emperor Charles IV, who could sit motionless for hours, forcing impatient rivals to reveal their hands. These weren't just tactics, they were survival mechanisms in a world where the wrong inflection could trigger invasions. The aftermath of failed talks haunted rulers more than battles. When Byzantine Emperor Manuel I miscalculated during talks with the Seljuks, his misstep didn't just cost territory, it shattered his confidence. Chroniclers wrote of him staring at maps for weeks, replaying conversations in whispers, paralyzed by the fear that his next diplomatic move would be another historic blunder. The margin for error was razor-thin. Edward III's refusal to kiss the French envoy's cheek nearly reignited the 100 Years' War, all because protocol experts hadn't briefed him on a new custom. What's rarely acknowledged is how these pressures warped decision-making. The same kings who strategized brilliantly in wartime often made reckless concessions under negotiation fatigue, like John of England, surrendering vast lands to Philip Augustus after days without sleep, a lapse that fueled the Magna Carta revolt. The mind games didn't end when treaties were signed. Rulers then faced the Herculean task of selling compromises to their nobles, who'd brandish any concession as weakness. Perhaps the most poignant relics are the unsigned drafts buried in archives, documents with ink blots where trembling hands had hesitated, or margins scribbled with frantic revisions. These weren't just paperwork, they were snapshots of souls straining under the unbearable calculus of diplomacy, where every word chosen meant 1,000 lives altered. The true cost of medieval statecraft wasn't measured in gold or land, but in the silent screams of rulers who knew their pens were mightier than swords and twice as heavy to wield. The iron collar around Richard the Lionheart's neck wasn't the worst of his torment. It was the crushing realization that his captors saw him not as a king, but as merchandise. Held for ransom in a German castle, the warrior who'd faced Saladin's armies without flinching now had to endure something far more corrosive: irrelevance. His jailers mockingly offered to sell him back to England piece by piece, a finger, a toe taunting the very idea of royal divinity. For medieval rulers, captivity wasn't just imprisonment, it was existential annihilation, stripping away the sacred aura that separated kings from ordinary men. The physical conditions were brutal, damp cells, meager rations, chains that left wrists raw, but the psychological warfare cut deeper. Emperor Henry IV's humiliating walk to Canossa in the snow was staged as penance, but its true power lay in the imagery, a monarch reduced to a barefoot supplicant. Similarly, King John of France's captivity after Poitiers wasn't spent in squalor, but in gilded humiliation paraded through London like a trophy, then housed in the Tower with every comfort except dignity. These weren't just tactical moves, they were deliberate unravelings of the myth that kings were untouchable. The aftermath often proved more damaging than the captivity itself. Richard returned to England with a fury that shocked even his allies, launching punitive campaigns that drained his treasury and alienated nobles. The once charismatic leader now saw betrayal everywhere, his trust shattered along with his invincibility. Meanwhile, David II of Scotland emerged from 11 years of English imprisonment politically neutered, his authority so diminished that rivals openly defied him. The trauma didn't end with release, it metastasized, twisting governance into a series of overcorrections and paranoid reactions. Some rulers turned their ordeal into propaganda. Charles of Blois, the French duke captured during the Breton War of Succession, transformed his cell into a hermitage, spinning his suffering as saintly purification. But for most, the stigma was inescapable. When James I of Scotland was kidnapped by English pirates as a boy, the 18-year captivity left him culturally adrift, fluent in Chaucer's English but estranged from his own Highland nobles. His later attempts to impose English courtly customs sparked rebellions, proving that even survival came at a cost. The cruelest irony, these ordeals often backfired on the captors. Holding a king hostage was like gripping a live coal. The longer England kept John II of France, the more his absence destabilized their own occupied territories. Ransoms bankrupted kingdoms on both sides, while freed monarchs like Sigismund of Luxembourg returned with hardened resolve, forging alliances against their former jailers. The cycle of vengeance could span generations. Richard's imprisonment fueled Plantagenet hostility toward Germany for decades. What's rarely acknowledged is how captivity reshaped governance itself. Freed kings frequently centralized power, determined never to rely on unreliable vassals again. Philip VI of France created the first standing army after his son's capture at Poitiers, while Alfonso X of Castile overhauled succession laws following his brother's rebellions during his imprisonment. These weren't just policy shifts, they were trauma responses, institutionalizing the lessons of vulnerability. The deepest scars, however, were personal. Letters from imprisoned rulers reveal haunting patterns. John II's obsessive recounting of his chivalric code, as if clinging to a lifeline of identity. James I's poetry comparing himself to a caged nightingale. These men didn't just lose freedom, they lost the narrative of their own lives, forced to reconcile their divine right with the mundane reality of being someone else's prisoner. That dissonance, the space between crown and collar, is where we see them not as legends, but as broken, brilliant humans reassembling themselves in the dark. Ferdinand II's pen scratched feverishly across the parchment, his decree condemning Protestant rebels to death still damp with ink when the nightmares began. The Holy Roman Emperor, who'd launched the 30 Years' War to purify his realm of heresy, now lay awake hearing the screams of villages his armies had burned. This was the hidden torment of religious persecution, not just the blood spilled, but the haunting suspicion that every act of violence in God's name might instead be blasphemy. For rulers who believed their souls were as much at stake as their crowns, faith wasn't just a guiding light, it was a hall of mirrors where every reflection showed a different judgment. The weight of these decisions often surfaced in unexpected ways. Louis IX of France, canonized as a saint for his crusades, privately scourged himself with iron-tipped whips after ordering the burning of Jewish Talmuds. His confessors recorded his agonized question, "If Christ preached love, why do my hands smell of smoke?" Even Isabella of Castile, whose Reconquista was celebrated as divine triumph, commissioned a private chapel where she'd pray for hours, begging forgiveness for the Moors who died under her banners. These weren't empty gestures, they were the tremors of conscience in rulers who genuinely believed they served heaven, yet couldn't silence the human whispers of doubt. The cruelest irony lay in the theology itself. Medieval kings were taught that mercy toward heretics endangered countless souls, yet excessive harshness risked divine wrath. When Frederick II himself excommunicated twice, ordered the mass execution of Saracen rebels in Sicily, his chronicler noted the emperor's subsequent insomnia, his muttered readings of Augustine's writings on just war. The same ruler who'd built a reputation as the wonder of the world for his religious tolerance could suddenly become the architect of massacres, trapped between the demands of earthly power and celestial approval. Some rulers sought absolution through grotesque bargains. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Catherine de' Medici funded enough votive candles to fill Notre Dame for a year, as if light could erase the bloodstains from her dynasty's hands. Others, like the Spanish King Philip II, turned their courts into theaters of piety, rising at midnight to pray with monks, wearing hair shirts beneath silk robes, all while signing death warrants for Dutch Protestants. The dissonance was crushing. The more fervently they pursued purity, the more they questioned whether their zeal had become its own kind of sin. The most revealing cracks appeared in their final moments. Emperor Charles V, who'd spent decades battling Protestantism, shocked Europe by requesting a Lutheran hymn on his deathbed. His attendants refused, but the request itself betrayed a lifetime of unresolved tension. Similarly, Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, to history died clutching a crucifix made from wood allegedly salvaged from heretic pyres, her last whispered words begging Christ to weigh her true intentions. These weren't just deathbed conversions, they were final, desperate attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, to square the brutality of earthly power with the mercy of heavenly judgment. What's often forgotten is how this guilt shaped policy. The Spanish Inquisition's elaborate trial procedures, with their endless appeals and doctrinal debates, weren't just about fairness, they were escape valves for rulers terrified of condemning the innocent. When Torquemada demanded harsher measures, even Ferdinand and Isabella hesitated, their confessors warning that overzealousness could damn them. The same monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims also established protections for conversos, a contradictory patchwork born of spiraling moral uncertainty. Perhaps the most poignant evidence lies in the art they commissioned. The Escorial's library holds a chilling illuminated manuscript, a gift from Philip II to his son, depicting the Last Judgment with kings prominently featured among the souls being weighed. No warrior saints or triumphant angels grace these pages. Instead, the margins swarm with demons dragging crowned figures into flames. This wasn't just decoration, it was a father's silent confession, a warning that no earthly power could shield them from the ultimate reckoning. In the end, their greatest fear wasn't rebellion or defeat, but the dreadful possibility that in fighting for God, they'd somehow lost him. Edward II's treasury wasn't just empty, it was a gaping wound that bled rebellion. When his silver pennies were found to contain more copper than precious metal, the outcry wasn't merely about economics, it shattered the illusion of royal stability. Medieval rulers didn't just govern lands, they stewarded fragile ecosystems where a single bad harvest could spiral into famine, where overtaxation turned loyal subjects into torch-wielding mobs. The ledger books in their chambers weren't dry accounting tools. They were ticking bombs, each line item a potential fuse that could ignite revolt or collapse dynasties. Take the Great Famine of 1315. As crops failed across Europe, Philip IV of France faced an impossible choice: slash taxes to ease suffering and bankrupt the crown, or squeeze starving peasants for revenue and risk uprising. He chose the latter, only to watch his kingdom fracture under waves of peasant revolts and noble defections. The stress etched itself into his final days, chroniclers noting how the once formidable Iron King shuffled through palace corridors muttering grain prices like prayers, his hands trembling as he signed desperate edicts. Economic crises didn't just empty coffers, they hollowed out rulers from within, leaving behind shells of men who'd started their reigns with boundless confidence. The psychological toll of debt could be even more corrosive. When medieval kings borrowed often from Jewish or Italian bankers, they didn't just owe money, they surrendered sovereignty. Edward I of England's infamous expulsion of Jewish moneylenders in 1290 wasn't just bigotry, it was a desperate bid to erase his crushing debts by erasing his creditors. The move brought temporary relief but triggered a financial brain drain, leaving England without the sophisticated fiscal networks needed to fund future wars. The king's subsequent mood swings, documented in council meeting note, reveal a man trapped in a vicious cycle, borrowing to fund campaigns, then lashing out when repayment came due. Some rulers buckled under the strain in spectacular fashion. King John of England's financial desperation led to the Magna Carta, but less remembered are the nights he reportedly tore at his clothes in rage after discovering yet another depleted treasury report. His notorious temper wasn't just personality, it was the outbursts of a man watching his grip on power slip through gold-dusted fingers. Similarly, Charles I of Spain's reign saw him weeping over interest payments to German bankers that exceeded entire provinces' annual output. His Habsburg jaw clenched so tight his teeth allegedly cracked from the pressure. The cruelest irony, many economic disasters were unavoidable. Climate change, the Little Ice Age ruined harvests no policy could fix. The Black Death wiped out tax-paying populations overnight. Yet rulers bore the blame regardless. Their mental health collateral damage in systems that equated divine favor with full granaries. When the Burgundian dukes faced repeated crop failures, their court physicians diagnosed melancholia fiscalis, a depression specifically tied to financial despair. Treatment involved herb tinctures and sessions with accountants, as if the cure for existential dread lay in balanced books. Perhaps most revealing are the coping mechanisms that seeped into governance. Richard II instituted the first English poll tax not through cold calculation, but during a nervous breakdown after his French campaigns bankrupted the crown. The subsequent Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where rebels stormed London chanting, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It wasn't just protest, it was collective trauma unleashed. Richard's handling of the crisis, first promising reforms, then brutally executing leaders, exposed the schizophrenia of rule under economic terror, the whipsaw between compassion and survival instinct. These rulers left behind more than fiscal records, they left psychological blueprints. The ledgers of Henry IV of France show columns where treasury sums should be, replaced with manic scribbles about divine deliverance. The personal prayer book of Isabella of Castile contains margin notes calculating interest rates alongside pleas for heavenly intervention. These artifacts expose the dirty secret of medieval economics. Behind every tax policy and grain subsidy stood a human being, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible math of power with the fragile calculus of their own unraveling mind. The true cost of rule wasn't measured in gold marks, but in sleepless nights spent listening for the clink of coins in the treasury, or the distant rumble of hungry crowds at the gates. Margaret of Anjou didn't just lose battles, she lost the right to fight them. When the Lancastrian queen took command of England's armies during her husband's madness, chroniclers didn't praise her courage, they called her unnatural, a she-wolf defying God's order. This wasn't just political slander, it was the collision of leadership and gender in a world where crowns sat uneasily on women's heads. Queens didn't merely share their male counterparts' burdens, they carried extra weight, their every decision scrutinized through a lens that magnified weakness or condemned strength. A king's assertiveness was divine will, a queen's was defiance. His tears were piety, hers were hysteria. The same traits that made rulers like Henry V legendary became liabilities when embodied by women, turning the throne into a psychological minefield where every step risked explosion. Consider the impossible tightrope walked by Isabella of Castile. To secure her fractured kingdom, she led troops in full armor, but always with a chaplain at her side, framing campaigns as holy missions rather than personal ambition. Her contemporary, Ferdinand, could wage war on a whim. Isabella had to cloak her strategic genius in piety, lest critics accuse her of neglecting womanly virtues. Even childbirth, that most feminine of duties, became political theater. While kings sired heirs and moved on, queens like Anne Boleyn faced life or death pressure to produce sons. their wombs treated as national property. Failure meant more than personal grief. It could mean charges of witchcraft or divine disfavor, as Catherine of Aragon discovered when her miscarriages were weaponized against her. The cruelest double standard lay in the realm of emotion. Men like Louis IX of France were praised for weeping at Mass, their tears proof of saintly humility. But when Mary, Queen of Scots, sobbed after her forced abdication, her jailers reported it as evidence of instability. The same chroniclers who marveled at Charlemagne's fiery temper labeled Empress Matilda's justified rage as hysterical fury during her fight for the English crown. This emotional straitjacket forced queens into exhausting performances. Helena of Aquitaine mastered the art of calculated smiles during her imprisonment, while Elizabeth I perfected the virgin queen persona, using celibacy as both shield and sword against accusations of irrational passion. Some rulers weaponized these expectations. Clever queens like Blanche of Castile turned maternal imagery into political capital, ruling France as regent by presenting herself as the mother of the realm. Others, like the Byzantine Empress Irene, went further, blinding her own son to secure power, then donating lavish gifts to monasteries to soften the scandal. But these strategies came at a cost. The more a queen conformed to gendered ideals, the harder it became to exercise real authority. Witness Joanna the Mad of Castile, whose legitimate political concerns were dismissed as madness by a husband eager to seize her throne, or Margaret of Denmark, whose shrewd governance was overshadowed by rumors of witchcraft stirred up by disgruntled nobles. The toll of these pressures surfaces in private artifacts. Mary Tudor's prayer book bears wine stains, possibly from tears on psalms about persecution. Catherine de Médicie's letters reveal a woman who signed death warrants with one hand while clutching fertility amulets with the other. Even Elizabeth I, the master of image control, left behind portraits where the layers of white lead makeup can't quite conceal the shadows under her eyes, the physical cost of decades spent balancing femininity and power. What's rarely acknowledged is how these constraints shaped history itself. When queens like Matilda or Urraca of Leon were blocked from rule, their exclusion triggered civil wars. The very stigma that forced women to rule indirectly through husbands or sons often destabilized kingdoms, as seen in the Anarchy or the Wars of the Roses. The psychological burden wasn't just personal. It was geopolitical, with millions paying the price for a system that simultaneously demanded queens save their realms and condemned them for wielding the tools to do so. Perhaps the most telling contrast lies in how history remembers them. Male rulers are often forgiven their cruelties as necessities of power. Henry VIII's 6 wives overshadowed by his greatness. But queens like Margaret of Anjou or Marie Antoinette remain frozen in popular memory as villains, their leadership recast as manipulation, their resilience as ruthlessness. The true weight of their crowns wasn't the gold or jewels, it was the invisible millstone of expectation, grinding down their legacies long after their hearts stopped beating. Charles VI of France didn't wake up mad one morning. His unraveling was slow, torturous, and utterly public. The first episode struck during a forest hunt in 1392, when the king suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own knights, screaming that traitors surrounded him. For the next 3 decades, his court lived in suspended terror, never knowing whether they'd face a lucid monarch or a shattered man who believed he was made of glass, shrieking if anyone came too close. This wasn't just personal tragedy, it was a constitutional crisis with a human face, where the divine right of kings collided with the brutal reality of a mind at war with itself. Madness in medieval rulers wasn't merely a medical condition, it was a political earthquake. When a king like Charles forgot his own name or ran naked through palace corridors, it wasn't just embarrassing, it called into question the very foundation of power. Monarchs were supposed to be God's anointed, their rationality proof of divine favor. So what happened when that rationality crumbled? The answer was a grotesque dance of denial and desperation. Charles's courtiers developed elaborate rituals to humor his delusions, covering corridors with cushions when he feared shattering, addressing him as George during periods when he denied being king. Every performance of normalcy was a thread holding the fabric of the realm together, however thinly. The psychological toll on those around the throne was equally devastating. Queen Isabel found herself trapped in an impossible position, ruling as regent while her husband's episodes worsened, yet unable to officially declare him unfit without triggering a succession crisis. Their son, the Dauphin, grew up in the shadow of his father's erratic violence, once narrowly escaping death when Charles mistook him for an assassin. The court split into factions, those who exploited the king's lucid intervals to push agendas, and those who whispered that his affliction was divine punishment for France's sins. Governance became a waking nightmare where every decree might be overturned during the next bout of psychosis. Other European rulers watched France's unraveling with visceral dread. In England, Richard II, already prone to paranoia, reportedly kept physicians on constant retainer after hearing of Charles's breakdown, obsessively questioning them about symptoms. The Holy Roman Emperor Wenceslaus, known for his drunken rages, faced intensified scrutiny from electors fearing a French malady might spread eastward. Madness wasn't just a personal failing, it was contagious in its consequences, eroding the mystique of monarchy itself. Treatment options ranged from useless to barbaric. Charles's doctors prescribed everything from powdered pearls to therapeutic beatings, while astrologers blamed misaligned planets. Some interventions worsened the crisis isolation during episodes bred deeper paranoia, while purges and bloodletting left the king too weak to resist delusions. The few moments of clarity became tragic in their brevity. Chroniclers describe the king suddenly recognizing his wife after months of blank stares, only to collapse into sobs, begging forgiveness for his unroyal behavior before the fog descended again. The broader implications reshaped medieval politics. France's nobility exploited Charles's instability to reclaim power, setting the stage for the Armagnac-Burgundian civil war that would later enable Joan of Arc's rise. Legal scholars began quietly debating protocols for incapacitated rulers, a dangerous discussion when kings derived authority from God, not constitutions. Even language shifted. Court documents started avoiding direct references to the king's health, speaking instead of temporary indispositions, in fear that admitting the truth would shatter the illusion of stability. What's often overlooked is how these rulers experienced their own unraveling. Charles's rare coherent letters reveal flashes of terrified self-awareness. "I feel my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm," he wrote to his brother. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, who survived deposition and mutilation only to regain his throne, reportedly kept mirrors covered, unable to bear the sight of his own scarred face, a physical manifestation of his fractured psyche. These weren't just mad kings, they were men drowning in their own minds, acutely aware of their failing grip on reality, even as their divine office demanded they project infallibility. The fear of inherited madness haunted dynasties for generations. Henry VI of England, Charles's grandson, would inherit not just the French crown but his grandfather's mental fragility, collapsing into catatonia at critical moments. Across Europe, royal marriages suddenly required scrutiny of brides' family histories for melancholic humors. The stigma lingered longest in Spain, where Juana la Loca's alleged insanity, likely exaggerated by power-hungry relatives, became a cautionary tale whispered to princesses for centuries. In the end, these rulers' greatest terror wasn't death or defeat, but the gradual slipping away of their own minds, the dread that one morning they might wake up strangers to themselves, yet still be expected to wield power over millions. That tension between human frailty and divine mandate is where we see medieval kingship at its most raw, not in the splendor of coronations, but in the silent moments when a confused old man in a crown asked his attendants again and again, "Am I still the king?" And no one dared answer honestly. The royal banquet hall reeked of roasted peacock and spilled wine, the air thick with laughter that bordered on hysteria. Henry VIII didn't just host feasts, he orchestrated spectacles of excess so grandiose they bordered on self-destruction. Swans encased in gold leaf, sugar sculptures taller than courtiers, rivers of ale flowing through palace courtyards. These weren't celebrations. They were obliteration rituals, frantic attempts to drown the screams of stress beneath a tidal wave of sensory overload. For rulers trapped in the gilded cage of duty, hedonism wasn't indulgence, it was anesthesia. Take Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king, who built Neuschwanstein Castle not as a palace but as a stage for his fantasies. While his ministers begged him to address state affairs, Ludwig spent fortunes on moonlit sleigh rides with actors playing Wagnerian heroes, entire nights lost in operatic daydreams. Modern historians often frame this as eccentricity, but his diaries reveal a darker truth. The king wrote of court life as a vise crushing my skull. His escapism a survival tactic against the unbearable pressure of ruling a nation hurtling toward modernity. Like Henry's feasts, Ludwig's castles were psychological life rafts, however flimsy. The tragedy lay in the backlash. Every attempt to escape stress through excess only compounded the original burden. Henry's legendary appetite, whether for food, women, or hunting, wrecked his health, leaving him a gout-ridden invalid whose pain fueled his notorious rages. Ludwig's spending bankrupted Bavaria, forcing his ministers to declare him insane and depose him. Even seemingly harmless indulgences carried hidden costs. Elizabeth I's love of sweets rotted her teeth, transforming the Virgin Queen's iconic smiles into a source of shame that fueled her legendary reclusiveness in later years. What made these coping mechanisms so destructive was their isolation. Unlike modern leaders who might attend therapy or take sabbaticals, medieval rulers had no sanctioned outlets for vulnerability. So they turned pleasure into a private rebellion, a doomed attempt to assert control over the one thing they still commanded, their own misery. Ivan the Terrible's infamous orgies alternated with bouts of monastic repentance, a pendulum swing between debauchery and self-loathing that mirrored his violent mood swings. For every public display of excess, there were private moments of crushing guilt. Henry VIII's secret hair shirts beneath ermine robes, Ludwig's tearful letters confessing his unworthiness after fantasy-fueled binges. The cruelest irony, their subjects rarely understood the desperation driving these spectacles. Peasants who starved during Henry's food waste saw only gluttony, not a man trying to fill some unfillable void. Nobles who mocked Ludwig's operatic pretensions missed his terror of the industrial age, eroding his beloved medieval traditions. Even today, we reduce these rulers to caricatures: the fat tyrant, the mad king, when in truth, their excesses were the tremors of souls buckling under expectations no human could bear. Perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the unpaid bills and inventory lists lurking in archives. Henry's kitchen accounts show sugar imports doubling during political crises. Ludwig's construction invoices spike during periods of parliamentary opposition. These dry receipts tell a more poignant story than any portrait: the cost of temporary escape measured in spices and stones. For rulers denied the basic human right to fall apart, excess became the only language left to scream for help, a language their world was determined to misunderstand. Charlemagne didn't just build palaces, he built legends in stone, his Auchian court shimmering with imported marble, gold-leafed arches, and ivory carvings hauled across the Alps at staggering cost. But behind the grandeur lay a brutal truth. Cultural patronage wasn't just about glory, it was a financial noose tightening with every masterpiece commissioned. The same ruler who revived classical learning also drained his treasury to do it, his scribes recording desperate pleas to bishops for loans when Saxon rebellions erupted mid-construction. This was the paradox of medieval kingship. The arts could cement your legacy, but they could also bleed your kingdom dry while rivals sharpened their swords. Take the Canterbury Cathedral's stained glass, commissioned by Henry II as penance for Becket's murder. The sunlight streaming through those jewel-toned windows was literally bought with the sweat of peasants' taxes, hiked to fund what amounted to the most expensive apology in history. And it wasn't just about piety. Every tapestry woven for a royal hall, every illuminated manuscript gifted to a monastery, was a calculated move in an unspoken tournament of prestige. When the Duke of Burgundy hosted feasts with automated golden birds that sang mechanically, he wasn't just entertaining guests. He was sending a message to the French king: "My workshops outshine your crown." The psychological toll was equally crushing. Alfonso X of Castile, the learned king, nearly bankrupted his realm funding astronomers and translators for his Toledo school, only to face revolts from nobles who scoffed at his ink-stained fingers. His obsession with crafting the perfect legal code, the Sciat Partitas, left him vulnerable to coup attempts, proving that intellectual ambition could be as dangerous as military failure. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian's construction of Hagia Sophia came at a harrowing personal cost. Chroniclers note his nightmares about the project's escalating expenses, once waking in a sweat after dreaming the dome had collapsed under the weight of its own extravagance. What made this burden so insidious was its invisibility. A king could justify war expenses to his nobles, they understood land and loot. But try explaining why he'd traded a year's wool revenue for a Flemish painter's altarpiece. Richard II's obsession with portrait tapestries woven with gold thread so fine it took a decade to complete became a rallying cry for his enemies, who framed his artistic passions as effeminate decadence. The same artworks meant to project power could, in the wrong light, become proof of weakness. Some rulers buckled under the pressure. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II filled Prague Castle with alchemical labs and arcane art, retreating into a private world of curiosities while his empire frayed. His cabinet of wonders, clockwork automatons, mythical beast skeletons, became a substitute for governance, the emperor preferring the company of astronomers and dwarves to the generals demanding his attention. Others, like Philip the Bold of Burgundy, turned patronage into a frantic arms race, commissioning tapestries so vast they required entire villages to weave them, their cost measured not in coins but in the hunger of taxpayers. Yet the cruelest twist was how ephemeral these investments proved. The libraries Charlemagne painstakingly assembled burned in Viking raids. The golden reliquaries of French kings melted down during revolutions. Even surviving masterpieces carried scars of their royal patrons' struggles. The Winchester Bible's unfinished illuminations hint at Henry II's sudden funding cuts during rebellions, while the cracks in Charles V's Granada Palace reflect the haste of its construction amid Moorish uprisings. Perhaps that's why so many rulers clung to their projects with near desperation. When Frederick II built his octagonal Castel del Monte, Its precise astronomical alignments weren't just scholarly vanity, they were a dying man's attempt to etch his name into the cosmos, to outlast the petty squabbles of mortal politics. The true cost of cultural patronage wasn't tallied in ledgers, but in the silent terror of knowing that art might immortalize you if it didn't ruin you first. Harold Godwinson's body wasn't just buried on that hill at Hastings, his entire lineage was erased from history with a single Norman arrow. The Anglo-Saxon king's defeat wasn't merely a military loss, it was a psychological earthquake that reverberated through generations of rulers who followed. Imagine being William the Conqueror in the weeks after his victory, walking through the wreckage of the battlefield where he'd gambled everything. The stench of death still hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of freshly minted coins bearing his likeness. This should have been his moment of triumph, yet contemporaries wrote of his sudden bouts of silence, his fingers tracing the scars on his shield, as if questioning whether his own victory was just another prelude to someone else's conquest. The spoils of war came laced with a poison no one anticipated, the paralyzing realization that today's conqueror could be tomorrow's corpse. The survivors of medieval defeats carried wounds far deeper than sword cuts. Robert the Bruce, before his legendary victory at Bannockburn, endured a crushing loss at Methven that forced him into hiding. Chronicles describe the Scottish king crouching in a cave, watching spiders rebuild their webs after storms as his own family was captured and executed. That winter of despair didn't just harden him, it rewired his understanding of power. When he finally emerged, his tactics had transformed. No more chivalric head-on charges, only guerrilla strikes and scorched earth. The man who'd once fought like a traditional knight now waged war like a fox, his strategies steeped in the bitter tea of humiliation. For royal women, defeat's aftermath was even more complex. After the Battle of Tewkesbury during the Wars of the Roses, Margaret of Anjou was paraded through London not in chains but in a carriage, a queen technically, yet stripped of all authority. Contemporary accounts note her eerie calmness, a mask that cracked only once when she glimpsed her dead son's body. That moment revealed the true cost of defeat, not lost lands or titles, but the obliteration of a mother's future. Her subsequent imprisonment wasn't in some dank dungeon, but in comfortable estates where she was treated as a forgotten relic, a living reminder that the worst punishment for a ruler wasn't death, but irrelevance. The ghosts of lost battles haunted military tactics for centuries. After the disastrous Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where overconfident crusaders were annihilated by Ottoman forces, a new cautiousness infected European courts. French knights who'd once mocked infantry began studying Turkish formations. Commanders instituted mandatory reconnaissance patrols. The trauma was so pervasive that 50 years later, when Hungarian General John Hunyadi faced the Ottomans again, he carried not just weapons but detailed diaries of Nicopolis' failures, turning someone else's catastrophe into his tactical Bible. Defeat's greatest legacy wasn't fear, it was forced innovation. Some rulers never recovered psychologically. Richard the Lionheart's younger brother, John, witnessed their family's empire crumble under French assaults, a helpless bystander as castles their father had built fell one by one. By the time he inherited the crown, his strategic decisions reeked of inherited trauma, hoarding treasure instead of funding armies, distrusting even loyal barons. The Magna Carta wasn't just born of noble ambition. It was the inevitable result of a king whose every policy was colored by the unhealed scars of watching his birthright disintegrate. The cruelest defeats were those dressed as victories. After his triumph at the Battle of Falkirk, William Wallace watched his countrymen starve as Edward I systematically destroyed Scotland's farmland. The psychological warfare was deliberate. English chroniclers recorded Wallace's transformation from fiery rebel to a man who spoke little and smiled never. His eventual capture and execution were almost an afterthought. The real destruction had been wrought years earlier when he realized winning battles couldn't compensate for a nation's broken spirit. What emerges from these stories isn't just a catalogue of losses, but a blueprint of how trauma reshapes leadership. The Plantagenets became paranoid after Hastings, the Habsburgs obsessive about marriage alliances after territorial losses, the Spanish monarchs fanatical about religious unity following the Reconquista's setbacks. Every dynasty bore the fingerprints of ancient catastrophes, their policies forged in the fires of old humiliations. The true weight of a crown wasn't measured in jewels or gold, but in the silent burden of knowing that one misstep could condemn not just a ruler, but an entire people to the ash heap of history. And so they marched forward, eyes fixed as much on the ghosts of the past as on the enemies before them. Frederick II's private chambers held more than state secrets. They housed a menagerie of the mind. While his subjects saw the Holy Roman Emperor as a warrior king, few knew of his midnight experiments with falconry, where he'd dissect wings to understand flight, or his clandestine correspondence with Arab mathematicians. Science wasn't just a hobby for Frederick. It was a lifeline, a realm where divine right meant nothing and empirical truth ruled. In a world that demanded he play the infallible monarch, his notebooks became confessional booths, filled with sketches of eclipses and questions about Aristotle that would have scandalized the church. His famed treatise on birds wasn't merely scholarly. It was an act of rebellion against the suffocating role of God's anointed. A silent declaration that even emperors needed spaces where curiosity outweighed ceremony. Isabella of Castile's oratory tells a different story of sanctuary. Behind its carved wooden doors, the queen who expelled Jews and funded Columbus knelt not as a sovereign, but as a supplicant. Her personal book of hours, its margins worn thin from anxious fingering, reveals prayers added in her own hand, pleas for guidance beneath the official script. The same woman who presided over the Inquisition's tribunals by day would spend nights in secret meditation, weeping over passages about divine mercy. Historians debate whether this was hypocrisy or humanity, but her chaplain's diary suggests a third possibility. These were the private tremors of a ruler torn between statecraft and soul. When she commissioned the stunning altarpiece at Toledo, its golden splendor visible to all, she also ordered a tiny, unadorned crucifix for her bedside, a stark reminder that even Catholic majesties wrestled with doubt. For some, escape took musical form. Richard the Lionheart, the archetypal warrior king, composed troubadour poetry during captivity, his verses dripping with unexpected vulnerability. Jonas Hans Pris, no prisoner can speak his mind, wasn't just a lament. It was coded subversion, allowing the proud Plantagenet to voice fears he'd never admit in court. Henry VIII's music room at Greenwich Palace witnessed a similar paradox. The tyrant who broke monasteries and wives found solace in composing hymns, his broad fingers surprisingly delicate on the lute. These weren't mere diversions, they were psychological pressure valves, creative outlets for men whose public roles forbade emotional honesty. Others turned to the animal kingdom for uncomplicated companionship. Charles V's retirement monastery swarmed with parrots from the New World, their raucous cries disrupting the solemn silence, a deliberate choice by an emperor weary of human intrigue. The Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene wrote of her father's menagerie, where a blind lioness became his confidante during civil wars, her roars drowning out the whispers of treacherous courtiers. Even the fearsome Vlad Dracul kept a kennel of hounds, their loyalty a stark contrast to the betrayal that had marked his childhood as an Ottoman hostage. In a world where every human interaction carried political weight, animals offered rulers something priceless: the freedom to be fragile. The most poignant escapes were geographical. Philip II's El Escorial doubled as both palace and prison, but its hidden garden, a geometric paradise of herbs and fountains, became his only retreat from the crushing weight of global empire. Here, amid the scent of lavender, the king who controlled continents could momentarily control nothing more demanding than a rosebush's pruning. Similarly, Elena of Aquitaine's vanished garden at Poitiers, described in troubadour songs as a court of love, may have been less romantic fantasy than psychological necessity, a space where the most powerful woman in Europe could briefly set aside the crown's calculations and simply breathe. These private sanctuaries didn't just preserve sanity, they shaped history. Frederick's scientific inquiries laid groundwork for the Renaissance. Isabella's piety fueled her controversial but transformative unification of Spain. Richard's songs became templates for chivalric romance that still color our view of the Middle Ages. The lesson isn't just that rulers needed hobbies, it's that the burdens they carried often forged unexpected paths forward, their personal coping mechanisms rippling outward to alter culture itself. Behind every throne stood not just a monarch, but a human being grasping for fragments of authenticity in a world that demanded perpetual performance. Their escapes, whether through falconry or prayer, music or gardens, weren't indulgences, but lifelines that allowed them to return, however reluctantly, to the crushing weight of duty. Merlin's shadow stretched far beyond the mists of Avalon. It slithered into the dreams of kings, whispering that their fates were already written. When Henry II heard the prophecy that his dynasty would end with a lamb, he spent decades scanning his sons for weakness, his paranoia poisoning family bonds until the prediction became a self-fulfilling curse. This wasn't just superstition, it was psychological warfare waged against oneself. Medieval rulers didn't merely inherit thrones, they inherited prophecies like ticking heirlooms, their reigns measured against ancient verses that claimed to know their endings before they began. Take the infamous Eagle of the Broken Covenant omen that haunted Richard the Lionheart. A soothsayer warned he'd die where eagles nested, so the king avoided castles with eagle crests and even altered his battle standards. Yet in his final days, struck by a crossbow bolt at Chalice Chabrol, he looked up to see the shooter's shield carved with a lone eagle. Whether coincidence or twisted fate, the moment shattered Richard's legendary composure. Chroniclers wrote of him trembling not from pain, but from the horrifying certainty that no amount of valor could outrun destiny. Some rulers weaponized prophecies to consolidate power. Young Henry V, facing rebellion, resurrected an old Welsh prediction that a dragon crowned in Monmouth would unite Britain, then made sure every bard from London to Cardiff knew he'd been born in Monmouth Castle under a dragon-shaped comet. His genius wasn't in believing the prophecy, but in bending it to his will, turning fatalism into a tool of psychological domination. Others weren't so savvy. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I became obsessed with the last Roman emperor myth, wasting resources on doomed campaigns to Constantinople's outskirts, convinced some ancient verse held the secret to saving his crumbling empire. The cruelest prophecies were those that preyed on parental love. When a mystic told Queen Isabella of Castile her son Juan would shine brighter than the sun, but briefly, she transformed his upbringing into a gilded prison banning jousts, hiring teams of physicians, even postponing his marriage in hopes of cheating fate. The prince still died at 19, leaving Isabella to agonize whether her smothering vigilance had hastened the very tragedy she feared. Similarly, Henry VIII's terror over the seven-son curse, a legend claiming no Tudor monarch would reign beyond 3 generations, drove his marital chaos. Each divorce and execution another desperate rewrite of destiny's script. Yet amid the dread, there were flashes of defiance, facing the prophecy that a queen shall conquer where kings failed. Elizabeth I didn't cower, she embraced it. Her Tilbury speech, delivered in armor as the Spanish Armada approached, didn't just rally troops, it rewrote the Omens' meaning in real time, proving prophecies held power only if rulers surrendered to them. Likewise, when Saladin heard a seer predict Jerusalem would fall to a king who sleeps in the dust, he had the man flogged for demoralizing his troops, then won the city anyway through sheer strategy. The true weight of these prophecies wasn't in their accuracy, but in how they exposed the unbearable loneliness of command. When every decision held life or death consequences, the idea that outcomes might be preordained offered perverse comfort, a way to share the burden with unseen forces. Small wonder dying kings like Edward the Confessor had their final visions carefully documented, their delirium polished into prophecies for successors to wrestle with. These weren't just predictions, they were the last weapons of weary rulers, hurling their hopes and fears beyond the grave to shape kingdoms they'd no longer live to see. Edward I of England didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited a ghost. The spectre of his father, Henry III, loomed over every decision, the weak king who'd nearly lost the throne to rebellion, whose piety had been mistaken for passivity. Edward's entire reign became a furious repudiation of that legacy. Fortresses like Caernarfon Castle weren't just military strongholds, they were psychological monuments to everything his father had failed to build. This was the cruel paradox of royal succession. The very fathers who gave their sons power also shackled them with impossible standards, leaving heirs to spend their lives either running toward their predecessors' shadows or fleeing them. For daughters like the Empress Matilda, the weight was even heavier. When her father Henry I named her his heir, it wasn't empowerment, it was a trap. The barons who'd sworn oaths to support her as queen broke them the moment Henry died, declaring that a woman could not hold the sword of state. Matilda's subsequent civil war against her cousin Stephen wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a decades-long scream for validation, proof that she could meet the very expectations her gender made society refuse to acknowledge. Her eventual compromise, securing the throne for her son rather than herself, wasn't surrender. It was the heartbreaking pragmatism of a woman who'd learned that parental approval alone couldn't rewrite centuries of tradition. The scars of these dynastic pressures shaped entire governments. Philip II of Spain transformed his sickly son Charles into a living reliquary of Habsburg ambitions, forcing the frail boy to endure endless councils and ceremonies until his hunched spine became a twisted metaphor for inherited duty. Meanwhile, Frederick the Great of Prussia composed flute sonatas in secret, his musical talent a quiet rebellion against his father's obsession with militarism, until the old king had Frederick's lover executed, a brutal reminder that royal children weren't permitted selves, only roles. Some rulers buckled entirely under the strain. Henry III of France, raised to emulate his warrior father Henry II, developed crippling anxiety attacks during battles, his body betraying the warrior image he'd been groomed to embody. His diaries reveal a man torn between two horrors, the fear of disappointing his ancestors and the terror of being crushed by their legends. Even successful monarchs like Elizabeth I wielded their parents' legacies as double-edged swords. Her famous vow to be the Virgin Queen wasn't just political strategy, but a pointed rejection of Henry VIII's marital chaos, her entire reign an elaborate correction of paternal excess. The cruelest twist was how these expectations warped parenting itself. The same rulers who resented their father's demands became equally tyrannical with their own children. Maria Theresa of Austria famously micromanaged her daughter Marie Antoinette's every gesture before her French marriage, drilling her for hours on court etiquette while whispering, "You must be perfect, or they'll say I failed." The message was clear: a child's mistakes weren't just personal failures but ancestral stains. Perhaps the most poignant evidence lies in the artifacts they left behind. Not treaties or crowns, but private testaments to this generational weight. Edward I's travel chess set, its pieces worn smooth from nervous handling during campaigns where he sought to outshine his father's meekness. Matilda's defiant seal as Lady of the English, pressed unevenly as if her hand had shaken with rage. These objects whisper what chronicles seldom admit, that behind every throne stood not just a ruler, but a child forever measuring themselves against ghosts, forever wondering if they'd finally done enough to earn the love that was their birthright, yet always somehow out of reach. Henry IV of France wasn't just growing old, he was watching his reflection in the mirror of history warp before his eyes. The once dashing warrior who'd charmed courts and quelled rebellions now shuffled through palace corridors with a stoop, his once fiery beard gone grey, his battle scars aching in the damp. But the true torment wasn't the physical decay, it was the whispers. The same nobles who'd once knelt eagerly now exchanged glances when he paused too long mid-sentence, their eyes flickering toward his son, the Dauphin, like vultures eyeing a weakening lion. In a world where kings were expected to embody divine vitality, aging wasn't just personal decline, it was political vulnerability made flesh. Consider the brutal symbolism of medieval kingship. Coronation rituals anointed rulers as God's chosen, but there was no sacrament for the moment their hands began to shake. When Charles V abdicated his vast empire in 1556, the ceremony was steeped in humiliation, his once commanding voice now so weak that a herald had to repeat his words, his trembling fingers dropping the scepter twice before his son could grasp it. The message was unmistakable. The same divinity that flowed into a king at his crowning could apparently leak out through wrinkles and gout. Small wonder so many monarchs clung to power long past their prime, like Henry VIII insisting on being carried onto the tiltyard in full armor, his rotting leg hidden beneath gilt plating, determined to project strength even as his body betrayed him. The cruelty of aging was compounded by the culture that surrounded it. Medieval courts prized martial prowess and virility qualities that faded with time. The troubadour songs that once celebrated Richard the Lionheart's battlefield exploits had no verses for the arthritic king who could barely mount a horse. Louis XIV of France famously masked his aging with wigs and cosmetics, but even the Sun King couldn't stop his courtiers from gossiping about his faltering steps or the way his mistresses now feigned interest in an old man's affections. For rulers whose authority rested on performance as much as policy, each passing year was another crack in the facade, and then there were the heirs, those living reminders of mortality. The Dauphin lounging at banquets with his own faction of young nobles, the princess smuggling letters to foreign suitors behind her father's back. Every royal child was both insurance policy and existential threat. The aging Henry II of England saw this torment firsthand when his sons, impatient for power, rebelled against him. His final words, "Shame, shame on a conquered king," weren't just about lost battles, but the unbearable realization that his own blood now saw him as an obstacle. This generational tension reached grotesque extremes in places like Muscovy, where Ivan the Terrible beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing immodest clothing, then watched in horror as the trauma induced a miscarriage, the heir he'd longed for, destroyed by his own rage against the youth he envied. Some rulers attempted desperate reinventions, Ferdinand II of Aragon, feeling his influence wane after Isabella's death, launched a second campaign against Granada, not for territory, but to prove his waning body could still lead men. Others turned to spirituality, like Edward the Confessor building Westminster Abbey in his twilight years, less for God's glory than as a bulwark against oblivion. But the most tragic were those who refused to acknowledge time's passage at all, like Philip II of Spain, pottering over state documents even as his vision failed, his secretaries deciphering his increasingly illegible scrawls while factions maneuvered around his crumbling authority. The true cruelty of royal aging lay in its public spectacle. Modern leaders retired to memoirs and speaking circuits, but medieval kings had no exit strategies, only the relentless scrutiny of courtiers counting coughs and stumbles. When the once formidable Emperor Maximilian I began dozing during councils, his ministers took to imitating his snoring behind his back. The same chroniclers who'd once flattered a king's vigor now documented his decline with clinical precision. The Spanish ambassador's report on Charles IX's foul-smelling breath and yellowed eyes, the Parisian diarist noting Henry IV's palsied hand spilling wine at Pentecost feast. Every slip was gossip, every weakness a potential coup. Perhaps that's why so many aging rulers became obsessed with legacy projects, not just to secure their memory, but to assert control over time itself. The tapestries Henry VIII commissioned in his final years didn't depict his bloated present, but the golden youth who'd won at Flodden. The memoirs Emperor Charles V dictated at Yuste weren't about gout and abdication, but long ago battles where his body still obeyed him. In the end, their greatest fear wasn't death. It was irrelevance, the dread that history would remember them not in their prime, but as the frail figure behind the curtain, outstayed by the very future they'd created. And so they fought on, not against enemies or rebels, but against the most relentless foe of all. The clock ticking loudly in every hollow-cheeked portrait, every heir's impatient glance, every candle guttering out in the throne room's gathering dark. The weight of a medieval crown was never just gold and jewels, it was the crushing expectation of divinity, the gnawing fear of betrayal, the sleepless nights spent balancing mercy and survival. These rulers lived in a world where every decision echoed through generations, where weakness wasn't just personal failure but cosmic imbalance. Yet strip away the ermine robes and gilded thrones, and you'll find something startlingly familiar, the universal tremors of leadership. The same isolation that drove Charles VI of France to madness lurks in modern boardrooms where CEOs can't trust their own teams. The divine pressure that haunted Henry VIII mirrors today's leaders grappling with public scrutiny that treats missteps like moral crimes. Even the paralyzing dread of legacy, the fear that history will remember you as a cautionary tale, rather than a visionary, haunts politicians and entrepreneurs alike. What makes these medieval struggles so timeless is their raw humanity. When Richard the Lionheart composed poetry in captivity or Isabella of Castile scribbled prayers in her ledger books, they weren't just rulers, they were people trying to reconcile impossible expectations with their own frailties. That tension hasn't vanished, it's only changed costumes. The advisor who flatters instead of warns, the sleepless nights before a high-stakes decision, the way power distorts relationships, these aren't relics of the past. They're the shadow side of influence in any era. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in how these rulers coped or failed to. Some, like Louis IX, turned to ritual and piety, while others, like Henry VIII, drowned their doubts in extravagance. Their choices, flawed, desperate, brilliant, offer a mirror to modern leaders navigating burnout and isolation. When a medieval king commissioned a tapestry or built a cathedral, it wasn't just vanity. It was an attempt to outlast mortality, to carve meaning into a world that demanded perfection. Today's equivalents, legacy projects, philanthropic ventures, even social media personas serve the same psychological purpose: armor against the terror of being forgotten or misunderstood. So the next time you face a leadership challenge, whether steering a company or simply navigating family dynamics, remember the monarchs who came before you. Their crowns may be dust, but their struggles live on in every moment where responsibility clashes with self-doubt, where the weight of others' expectations threatens to crack your resolve. History's rulers remind us that power doesn't elevate you above human frailty, it amplifies it, and that's the real takeaway. Leadership in any century isn't about being invincible. It's about bearing the weight without breaking, and having the courage to admit when you need help carrying it. If these stories of resilience and ruin resonated with you, share which ruler's struggle hit closest to home. And for more deep dives into the minds that shaped our world, subscribe, because understanding the past isn't just about knowledge, it's about recognizing ourselves in the